The accidental proposal. The transport shuttle descended through layers of iridescent clouds that shimmered like oil on water, and Marcus' chin pressed his forehead against the viewport, watching the alien world materialize beneath him. Valthera Prime sprawled across the horizon in sweeping arcs of silver architecture and bioluminescent gardens that pulsed with gentle rhythms. He had been called here as part of the human diplomatic corps, specifically requested because of his reputation for fixing things that everyone else had given up on. What he hadn't expected was to be thrown into the middle of the largest interspecies summit in galactic history, surrounded by beings whose technology made human engineering look like children playing with blocks. The shuttle touched down on a landing platform that seemed to be grown rather than built, its surface rippling slightly to absorb the impact. Marcus gathered his toolkit, a battered collection of instruments that had traveled with him across a dozen worlds, and stepped out into air that tasted faintly of copper and something sweet he couldn't identify. The Valthran greeting committee waited with perfect stillness, their tall frames draped in flowing garments that changed color with their breathing. Their most distinctive feature, the crown of sensory tendrils that rose from their heads like living coral, swayed gently as they assessed the newcomer. A protocol officer approached, his tendrils forming patterns that Marcus's translator chip interpreted as formal welcome. The human delegation had been housed in the western quarter, but before Marcus could be escorted to his quarters, a commotion erupted from the central plaza. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before, thousands of voices rising in a harmonious frequency that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The protocol officer's tendrils suddenly went rigid, and he gestured urgently for Marcus to follow. They hurried through corridors that curved like the inside of seashells, past gardens where plants seemed to lean toward them with curiosity. The noise grew louder, and Marcus could now distinguish individual voices within the chorus, all filled with what sounded like distress. They emerged into a vast ceremonial arena where delegates from 40 different species had gathered for what was supposed to be a historic peace signing. At the center of it all stood Queen Lyra of the Valthran Empire, and even from a distance, Marcus could see that something was terribly wrong. The Queen wore armor that was legendary throughout the known galaxies, a masterwork of bioengineered metal that had been passed down through her lineage for 3,000 years. It was said to be alive in some way, bonded to the royal bloodline, capable of responding to threats and amplifying the wearer's natural abilities. Right now, it was flickering like a dying star, pulses of light racing across its surface in chaotic patterns. The Queen stood perfectly still, her tendrils held in a position that Marcus's chip translated as extreme concentration, but he could see the tremor in her shoulders. The armor was failing, and from the panicked conversations around him, he gathered that this was more than a technical malfunction. It was a spiritual crisis, a political disaster, and potentially the end of the summit before it had even begun. Ambassador Reeves found Marcus in the crowd and grabbed his arm with the desperation of a drowning man. The human ambassador's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling over each other. The Valthrans believed the armor's failure was an omen, a sign that the peace talks were cursed. Half the delegates were already preparing to leave. The Queen couldn't remove the armor without completing the ceremony, but if it failed completely while she wore it, the feedback could kill her. Their best technicians had tried everything, but the armor was rejecting all conventional repair methods. Marcus found himself being pushed forward before he could fully process what was being asked of him. The crowd parted as he walked toward the center of the arena, his toolkit feeling absurdly inadequate in his hands. He was acutely aware of thousands of eyes and eye analogs, watching his approach. The Queen's personal guard, warriors whose armor was less ornate but no less impressive, moved to intercept him, but Queen Lyra raised one hand in a gesture that froze them in place. She turned her full attention to Marcus, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical pressure. Her face was striking in a way that transcended species, with high angular features and eyes that held depths of violet and gold. Her tendrils, longer and more elaborate than those of her subjects, moved in patterns too complex for his translator to fully interpret. When she spoke, her voice resonated with harmonics that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to something deeper. She asked him a simple question, translated by his chip as whether he believed he could help where her own people had failed. Marcus took a breath and stepped closer, setting down his toolkit on the smooth floor. He had learned long ago that the key to fixing alien technology wasn't to treat it as alien, but to look for the universal principles that underlaid all mechanical and biological systems. Energy flow, structural integrity, feedback loops, these concepts transcended culture and evolution. He asked permission to examine the armor, and after a moment's hesitation, the Queen nodded. Her tendrils settled into a pattern that his chip labeled as trust, though he suspected the translation was simplified. He circled her slowly, his trained eye picking out details that the panicking technicians had probably missed in their urgency. The armor wasn't just failing, it was fighting something, trying to compensate for an imbalance that had thrown its entire system into chaos. He knelt beside a section near her hip where the flickering seemed most intense, pulling out a diagnostic scanner that he had modified himself. The readings made no sense at first until he realized he was looking at them wrong. The armor wasn't mechanical or biological, it was both and neither, operating on principles that human science was only beginning to understand. There, at the core of the affected section, he found it. A microscopic fracture in what appeared to be a crystalline lattice, so small that conventional scanners had probably dismissed it as irrelevant. But this wasn't a conventional system. In the armor's integrated design, that tiny fracture was propagating interference patterns throughout the entire structure, like a single wrong note turning a symphony into noise. The fix would be delicate, requiring him to essentially convince the armor to reroute its energy flows around the damaged section while simultaneously stabilizing the fracture. Marcus pulled out a tool that looked like a pen but functioned as a molecular welder, capable of working at scales where the distinction between matter and energy became philosophical. He had used it to repair quantum processors and neural interfaces, always with the understanding that he was as much artist as technician at these scales. He glanced up at the Queen, meeting her eyes, and saw something there that surprised him. Not just hope or desperation, but curiosity, a genuine interest in what he was about to attempt. He pressed the tool against the armor's surface and began to work. The material resisted at first, then slowly began to respond to his careful manipulations. He could feel it now, the way the armor was almost alive, possessing something like awareness or instinct. He found himself talking to it softly, explaining what he was trying to do, asking it to trust him. Around him, the arena had gone silent. Even the Queen seemed to be holding her breath. The repair took longer than he expected, his hands moving with practiced precision while his mind raced through calculations and intuitions. He made microscopic adjustments, tested the energy flow, adjusted again. Sweat dripped into his eyes, but he didn't dare wipe it away. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he felt something shift. The armor's chaotic flickering began to smooth out, patterns becoming coherent again. The fracture sealed itself under his guidance, the crystalline structure remembering its proper configuration. Marcus pulled his hand back and stood, his legs slightly unsteady. The armor had stabilized completely, its surface now glowing with steady, healthy light. But something unexpected was happening. Where his hand had touched the armor, a mark had appeared, glowing with the same violet and gold as the Queen's eyes. It spread slowly, forming an intricate pattern that resembled intertwined branches or rivers. The Queen gasped, her tendrils shooting upward in what his translator identified as profound shock. The arena erupted. Not in panic this time, but in something else entirely. The Valthrans began to chant, a word that his translator chip struggled with before finally settling on an approximation. Corvus. The meaning came through his chosen mate, bonded one, Groom. The sound built like a wave, other species joining in with their own variations, until the entire arena thundered with it. Marcus looked around in confusion, then back at the Queen, whose expression had transformed into something he couldn't read. One of her advisors rushed forward, an elderly Valthran whose tendrils were silver with age. He spoke rapidly, gesturing at the mark on the armor, at Marcus, at the Queen. The translator worked overtime, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as he began to understand. He had touched something called the Soul Bond Seal, a component of the armor that had never responded to anyone outside the royal bloodline. According to Valthran tradition, the armor could only accept the touch of the Queen's true partner, someone whose essence resonated with hers on a fundamental level. By repairing it, by placing his hand directly on the seal, he had done something that their culture interpreted in only one way. He had declared himself as a candidate for the Queen's consort. Marcus tried to speak, to explain that he had no idea, that he was just trying to help, but his words were drowned out by the continued chanting. The Queen raised both hands and silence fell instantly. She looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed confusion, curiosity, and something else he couldn't identify. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the arena. She acknowledged what had happened, confirmed that the armor had indeed accepted his touch in a way that had not occurred in living memory. According to the ancient traditions of her people, this meant he had been chosen, recognized by the armor itself as worthy. She then said something that made Marcus's head spin. He would be given the choice to accept or refuse this bond, But such a choice could not be made lightly or quickly. He would undergo the traditional trials, a series of tests designed to prove compatibility and worthiness. Only after completing these trials could he make his decision with full understanding of what it meant. To refuse without undergoing the trials would be seen as an insult not just to her, but to the armor itself, to the traditions that bound Valthran society together. The implications crashed over Marcus like a physical weight. He had come here to fix a piece of equipment, and somehow he had stumbled into something that resembled a marriage proposal, filtered through 3,000 years of alien culture and spiritual tradition. The Queen was watching him, waiting for his response, and he realized that whatever he said next would echo far beyond this arena. The peace summit, the delicate web of alliances, the future of human-Valthran relations, all of it now somehow tangled up with his accidental activation of an ancient bonding ritual. Marcus took a deep breath and looked at the Queen, really looked at her. Behind the regal bearing and the weight of crown, he saw someone as trapped by this situation as he was, bound by traditions she couldn't simply dismiss. He saw intelligence in those remarkable eyes and something else, perhaps a hint of amusement at the absurdity of it all. In that moment he made a decision that surprised him. He would undergo the trials not because tradition demanded it, but because walking away felt like the coward's choice. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination he brought to every impossible problem he had ever been asked to solve. He spoke clearly, loud enough for the translator systems to pick up his words and broadcast them throughout the arena. He accepted the challenge. He would undergo the trials and prove whether the armor's choice had meaning or was simply an accident of circumstance. The crowd erupted again, but this time Marcus stood his ground, meeting the Queen's gaze. For just a moment, he saw her tendrils form a pattern his chip translated as respect, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched her lips. The trials of understanding. Morning light filtered through crystalline walls that seemed to breathe with their own luminescence, and Marcus woke to find himself in quarters far more luxurious than anything the human delegation had been assigned. Somewhere during the chaos of the previous evening, he had been moved to the royal wing of the palace, a decision that apparently required no consultation with him whatsoever. He sat up slowly, his mind still processing the surreal turn his life had taken. Through the transparent ceiling, he could see Valthera's twin moons still visible in the dawn sky, hanging like pearls against the fading darkness. He had accidentally proposed to an alien queen by fixing her armor, and now he was expected to prove himself worthy through trials that nobody had bothered to fully explain. A soft chime announced a visitor, and before Marcus could respond, 3 Valthran attendants entered carrying what he assumed were ceremonial clothes. They moved with practiced efficiency, their tendrils communicating in rapid patterns that his translator couldn't keep up with. Within minutes, he found himself dressed in garments that shifted between deep blue and silver as he moved, the fabric somehow adjusting to fit him perfectly despite being designed for a completely different body structure. One of the attendants, whose name his chip translated as Velis, informed him that the first trial would begin within the hour. When Marcus asked what exactly the trial would entail, Velis's tendrils formed a pattern that translated roughly as amused sympathy, and he was told that discovering the nature of each trial was part of the test itself. The ceremonial hall where Marcus was led could have held 1,000 people, but this morning it contained only a small gathering of what appeared to be high-ranking officials and advisors. Queen Lyra stood at the center, her armor now functioning perfectly, its surface rippling with subtle patterns of light. She had changed since yesterday, seeming somehow more present, more focused. When she saw Marcus enter, her tendrils lifted in what he was learning to recognize as acknowledgement. She waited until he reached the center of the hall before speaking, her voice carrying that same resonant quality that seemed to bypass normal hearing. She explained that the first trial was called the Maze of Intentions, an ancient test designed to reveal the true nature of a person's character. Marcus would be presented with a problem, and how he chose to solve it would demonstrate whether his intentions aligned with the values that Valthran society held sacred. Before he could ask for clarification, the floor beneath him began to shift, panels sliding apart to reveal a 3-dimensional holographic display. The image showed a sector of space, star systems connected by trade routes, and a complex web of political relationships between various species and factions. An advisor stepped forward and presented the scenario. 3 different species occupied neighboring systems, each with legitimate territorial claims based on historical precedent, resource needs, and strategic considerations. Tensions had been building for decades, and now stood on the brink of open warfare. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed. The Valthran Empire had been asked to mediate, but every proposed solution satisfied one party while enraging the others. This was not a hypothetical scenario, the advisor explained, but a real crisis that the Queen herself would need to address after the summit concluded. Marcus's task was to propose a solution that no one had yet considered. Marcus stared at the display, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon him. This was not what he had expected. He was a technician, an engineer, not a diplomat or political strategist. But as he studied the holographic representation, he began to see patterns that felt familiar. Resource distribution networks, competing optimization requirements, systems and dynamic tension, these were problems he had dealt with in different contexts throughout his career. He started asking questions, drilling down into details about each species' actual needs versus their stated demands, about the history that had led to this point, about resources and capabilities that might not be immediately obvious. The advisors answered his questions with growing interest, their tendrils beginning to move in patterns that suggested engagement rather than skepticism. Marcus walked around the display, looking at it from different angles, his mind working through possibilities. The solution, when it came to him, felt almost obvious, the kind of lateral thinking that had made him valuable as someone who fixed impossible problems. He began to speak, outlining an approach that none of the traditional diplomats had considered because it required thinking beyond conventional political frameworks. Instead of trying to divide the disputed territories, Marcus proposed treating the entire region as a shared resource managed by a joint commission representing all three species. Each species would maintain sovereignty over their core systems, but the contested areas would become collaborative zones where all three worked together on projects that benefited everyone. The key was identifying endeavors that required the unique capabilities of all three species, making cooperation more valuable than conflict. He pointed out specific examples in the data, places where one species had mining expertise, another had agricultural technology, and the third had transportation infrastructure. Separately, none could fully exploit the region's potential. Together they could create something unprecedented. The hall fell silent as Marcus finished his explanation. He had no idea if his solution was brilliant or naive, but he had approached it with honesty and the problem-solving instincts that had guided him throughout his life. Queen Lyra stepped closer to the display, studying the proposal he had outlined. Her tendrils moved through a complex sequence of patterns, and when she finally looked at him, something had shifted in her expression. She announced that his solution demonstrated the key quality that the trial was designed to test, the ability to see beyond immediate conflicts to underlying possibilities, to create value rather than simply dividing it. His approach honored the Valthran principle of harmony through synthesis rather than domination. The advisors erupted in discussion, some already working through the implications of Marcus's proposal for the actual diplomatic crisis they faced. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had passed the first trial, but not through any special knowledge of Valthran culture or political philosophy. He had simply applied the same thinking he used when faced with any complex system, looking for elegant solutions that respected all the constraints rather than brute forcing through them. As the gathering began to disperse, Queen Lyra approached him directly for the first time since the previous day's chaos. She asked him to walk with her, and Marcus found himself following the queen through gardens that seemed to exist in deliberate harmony with the palace structure, plants and architecture flowing into each other without clear boundaries. They were alone except for two guards who maintained a respectful distance, far enough that their conversation could remain private. The queen's tendrils had settled into a relaxed pattern, and when she spoke, her voice had lost some of its formal edge. She told him that she had been surprised by his solution, not because it was clever, but because it revealed something about how humans approach problems. Where Valthran thinking often focused on maintaining balance within existing structures, human thinking seemed more willing to reimagine the structures themselves. Marcus found himself relaxing as they walked, the surreal nature of his situation somehow becoming more manageable in this quiet moment. He asked her about the loneliness he had glimpsed in her eyes during yesterday's crisis, a question that would have been far too personal if they hadn't already been entangled in this bizarre bonding ritual. She was quiet for a long moment, her tendrils forming patterns that his translator marked as contemplative. When she finally answered, she spoke of the isolation that came with her position, the way she was surrounded by advisors and courtiers yet rarely encountered anyone who saw her as anything other than a symbol or a strategic asset. The armor that marked her status also created a barrier between herself and genuine connection. She admitted that part of her had been intrigued when the armor accepted his touch, not because she believed in destiny or prophecy, but because it represented something unexpected in a life that had become entirely predictable. Every day was prescribed by duty, every interaction choreographed by protocol. Then a human technician had knelt beside her, talked to her armor like it was a nervous animal, and somehow cut through 3,000 years of tradition with nothing but intuition and stubbornness. There had been something refreshing about that moment, something that felt authentic in a way little in her life did anymore. Marcus surprised himself by understanding exactly what she meant. He had spent his career being valued for a specific skill set while the rest of him remained largely invisible to the people around him. Colleagues knew him as the person who fixed things, but few had bothered to learn much beyond that professional identity. The loneliness of being reduced to a single function, even a valued one, was something that apparently transcended species boundaries. They walked in companionable silence for a while, and Marcus realized that something had shifted between them. The absurdity of their situation hadn't changed, but perhaps they were beginning to see each other as actual people rather than symbols or problems to be solved. The second trial came that afternoon, and this time Marcus had been given some warning about what to expect. The Dance of Stars was a Valtharan ceremony that dated back millennia, a ritual that required partners to move in synchronized patterns while balancing on floating platforms that shifted and rotated in complex configurations. It was meant to demonstrate harmony of minds, the ability to anticipate and complement each other's movements. Marcus had been given 2 hours to observe recordings of the dance and practice basic movements, which he suspected was generous compared to what most candidates received. It wasn't nearly enough time. The ceremony took place in an amphitheater open to the sky, with hundreds of Valtharans gathered to witness this unprecedented trial. Marcus stood on the starting platform wearing specially designed footwear that was supposed to help with balance, though he suspected nothing short of magnetic boots would make him graceful in this arena. Queen Lyra stood across from him on her own platform, her armor gleaming in the afternoon light, her posture perfect. The platforms between them began to activate, rising and rotating in a sequence that looked impossible to predict. The music started, a harmonic composition that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and Queen Lyra began to move. She flowed across the shifting platforms with effortless grace, her movements perfectly timed to the rotation and rise of each surface. Marcus took a breath and launched himself forward, trying to remember the patterns he had studied. He made it 3 platforms before his timing failed and he had to windmill his arms frantically to avoid falling. The crowd's reaction was a collective intake of breath, but Marcus recovered and pushed forward. The queen had paused, waiting for him to catch up, her expression neutral. They tried to synchronize on a rotating platform, moving in the circular pattern he had seen in the recordings. Marcus managed about half the rotation before his foot slipped and he stumbled, catching himself but completely destroying any semblance of harmony. Frustration built in his chest. He was never going to master this in one attempt, never going to move with the fluid grace that came naturally to Valtharans. He was failing and doing it in front of hundreds of witnesses. Then something shifted in his thinking. He was trying to copy Valtharan movements, to succeed at their dance using their methods. But the trial wasn't about becoming Valtharan, it was about demonstrating compatibility, about finding harmony between different approaches. Marcus stopped trying to perfectly replicate the traditional patterns and instead began to adapt them, using his lower center of gravity and different sense of balance to create variations that worked with his human physiology rather than against it. Where the queen moved with flowing grace, he moved with calculated precision, timing his steps to arrive at the right place even if the path he took was different from hers. The queen noticed the change immediately. Her tendrils lifted in what might have been surprise, and then she began to adapt as well, adjusting her movements to complement his rather than expecting him to simply follow. They met on a large central platform that was rotating slowly, and for a moment they moved together, not in traditional synchronization but in a new pattern that incorporated both their styles. When Marcus stumbled again, the queen was there, her hand catching his arm with perfect timing, turning his near fall into part of the dance. They finished the sequence together, his human determination balancing her Valtharan grace, creating something that was neither traditional nor chaotic but uniquely theirs. The amphitheater erupted in a sound that Marcus's translator couldn't properly interpret, but the tone was unmistakably positive. They had succeeded, not by having Marcus become something he wasn't, but by both of them adapting to create a new kind of harmony. As they stood together on the final platform, catching their breath, the queen looked at him with an expression that seemed almost like pride. Her tendrils formed a pattern his chip translated as impressed respect, and she spoke softly enough that only he could hear. She told him that in 3,000 years of tradition he was the first person to ever change the dance itself rather than simply performing it, and that perhaps that was exactly the kind of thinking her people needed. That evening, as the moons rose over the palace, Marcus was summoned to the queen's private chambers for what was described as a consultation before the final trial. He found her alone on a terrace that overlooked the glowing gardens, her armor removed for the first time since he had met her. Without it, she seemed somehow more vulnerable, more present. She offered him a beverage that tasted like starlight and honey, and they sat together looking out at the city below. She asked him if he had any regrets about accepting the trials, about being caught up in traditions that weren't his own. Marcus thought about the question seriously before answering. He admitted that the situation was surreal and often uncomfortable, but he didn't regret it. The trials had pushed him to think and act in ways he never would have otherwise, and somewhere in the process he had stopped seeing this as just an obligation to be fulfilled. He had begun to genuinely want to understand her culture, to prove not just that he could pass arbitrary tests but that connection was possible between people from such different worlds. He turned the question back on her, asking if she regretted the armor's choice, if she wished none of this had happened. The queen was quiet for a long time, her tendrils moving in slow, contemplative patterns. When she finally spoke, she said something that surprised them both. She admitted that she had spent her entire life preparing to be queen, learning to set aside personal desires in service of duty and tradition. She had accepted that she would eventually bond with someone chosen by advisors for political advantage, someone appropriate who fit neatly into the structures that governed her life. Then Marcus had appeared and disrupted everything, forcing her to confront questions she had buried long ago about what she actually wanted, about whether duty and genuine connection had to be mutually exclusive. She turned to look at him directly, and in her eyes Marcus saw a reflection of his own uncertainty and hope. She told him that tomorrow would bring the final trial, the bond of choice, where he would have to publicly declare whether he accepted or rejected the bond that the armor had recognized. Whatever he chose, she would respect, but she wanted him to know that she no longer saw this as merely a ceremonial obligation. Something real had developed between them over these past days, something she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. For the first time in her life, she found herself hoping that duty and desire might align. Marcus felt his heart racing as he processed her words. He had been so focused on getting through each trial, on not causing a diplomatic incident, that he hadn't fully acknowledged what he himself was feeling. But sitting there under alien moons with this remarkable woman, he couldn't deny the truth. He was drawn to her intelligence, her strength, the glimpses of humor and vulnerability she allowed him to see. The cultural differences that should have made connection impossible somehow made it more meaningful, each moment of understanding a small victory against entropy and separation. The next morning, Marcus stood once again in the great ceremonial hall, but this time the atmosphere was different. Every major delegate from the summit had gathered, along with what seemed like half the population of the capital city watching through holographic feeds. This was the moment that would determine not just his personal fate but potentially the future of human-Valthran relations. The final trial was elegant in its simplicity. He would be asked a single question and his answer would be binding. There would be no second chances, no room for diplomatic ambiguity. Queen Lyra stood before him in her full ceremonial regalia, the armor he had repaired gleaming with renewed vitality. Her tendrils were held in a formal pattern, but her eyes, those remarkable violet and gold eyes, held a warmth meant only for him. The eldest advisor stepped forward to speak the ritual words, asking Marcus if he accepted the bond that the armor had recognized, if he chose to stand as partner to the queen, to join his life with hers in harmony and purpose. The hall fell silent, waiting for his response. Marcus looked at the queen and saw past the ceremony to the person beneath. He thought about everything he had learned over the past days, about loneliness and duty, about the unexpected connections that could form between the most unlikely people. He thought about the way she had adapted her dance to complement his movements, the quiet conversations on the terrace, the glimpses of a future that neither of them had planned but both might want. The answer came not from obligation or political calculation, but from a place of genuine feeling that surprised him with its certainty. He spoke clearly, his words translated and broadcast to every corner of the hall and beyond. He accepted the bond, not because tradition demanded it, not because diplomacy required it, but because in trying to prove himself worthy, he had discovered something worth proving himself for. He chose Lyra not as a queen or a political symbol, but as someone he had come to respect, admire and care for deeply. The armor's choice might have been an accident, but his choice now was entirely deliberate. The queen's tendrils lifted in a pattern his chip translated as joy, and for the first time since he had met her, she smiled with unguarded happiness. She stepped forward and took his hands, her touch gentle despite the armor's strength. She spoke words in her own language, then repeated them in his. She accepted his choice and offered her own in return, declaring before all assembled that she chose him as well, this human who had stumbled into her life and reminded her that even the most rigid traditions could bend to accommodate something genuine and new. The hall erupted in celebration, the sound building until it seemed to shake the very walls. But Marcus barely heard it. He was focused entirely on the woman before him, on the beginning of a journey that neither of them could have predicted. As they stood together while their two peoples celebrated around them, Marcus realized that he had come to this world to fix a piece of broken armor, but instead he had found something he hadn't known he was missing. And sometimes the best repairs were the ones you never planned to make.